Hi, in this video, we'll start talking about how to read a paper. And we'll begin with the basics. So for the basics, we want to know, did you get the right paper? So we'll check the title, the impact of the minimum wage on health. Who wrote the paper? In this case, it was Elena Andreeva and Benjamin Ukert. Where was it published? It was published in the International Journal of Health Economics and Management. So with these three pieces of information, you can go into Google Scholar or any other search engine and find the paper. Next, we're going to read the abstract. And the abstract is a brief summary of the paper that answers a couple of important questions. First, what was the research question? The abstract says, this study evaluates the effect of minimum wage on risky health behaviors, healthcare access, and self-reported health. So what this is telling us is that the paper is about this relationship between the minimum wage and various things that we can do to affect health. How did they answer it? We used data from the 1993 through 2015 Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System and employed difference in differences strategy that utilizes time variation in new minimum wage laws across the United States. So this is saying that they're going to use a combination of data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, which is a large survey that's been done for about the past almost 40 years. It began before 1993. And then how they're going to use a differences in differences strategy to estimate the relationship between the minimum wage and these measures of health. So they're going to utilize or exploit the fact that states have passed new minimum wage laws over time, and that's where they're going to get this, what we call identification out of. So what did they find? What was their answer? Results suggest that the minimum wage increases the probability of being obese and decreases daily fruit and vegetable intake, but also decreases daily functional limitations. So this is telling us that there is in fact an effect of the minimum wage on a handful of outcomes. So as we look at the paper itself, we'll see that they actually explored a number of other outcomes as well. And some abstracts discuss the implications of the results. This one does not, but sometimes you'll see a section at the very end on implications for policy, for behavior, etc. And lastly, you can think of the abstract as a roadmap to the rest of the paper. So things you see in the abstract, you should also find in the paper itself. Maybe not in exactly the same words, but you should be able to find those points or those parts of the paper that buttress or support particular parts of the abstract. So now let's go into the body of the paper itself, and we'll start with the introduction. So the introduction here provides some background on the research question and notes that the last federal minimum wage hike was in 2009 and raised the minimum wage to $7.25 an hour, with several states having adopted their own minimum wage laws throughout this period. They also state that raising the minimum wage is premised on this idea that increasing the minimum wage is going to increase living standards or improve living standards for people who are affected by the minimum wage. Next, we're going to have a section about what is known on the topic. So here they talk about the effect of the minimum wage on health investments, and that effect is relatively unexplored. And they say this is possibly because of theoretical ambiguity, since minimum wage changes can increase or decrease consumption related to health because you have income and price effects that are working in opposite directions. They also note that there's a growing literature on the impact of the minimum wage on health outcomes that they're also contributing to. Lastly, they're going to give you a preview of the results. So our differences in differences estimate suggests that a $1 increase in the minimum wage negatively affects risky health behavior. So they're telling us how they got to their estimates and what they are. So now we're going to go on to thinking about the data. So the data section describes the data set that the authors chose to use and explains how the variables were constructed. So here they explain how they assigned minimum wages to each individual in the BRFSS data, and how they converted variables from their raw data into measures of smoking status, obesity, drinking status, all based on standard criteria. Often, they'll include a summary statistics table that provides basic descriptive information. Here, they've actually gone beyond the normal summary statistics table by splitting into two columns, by essentially saying, here's roughly a treatment group, areas that have minimum wages above the mean, and here's a control group, areas with a minimum wage below the mean. And typically, they then group the dependent variables together and provide the mean and standard deviation of each variable. So you're always going to provide some measure of central tendency, means or medians, and variability, standard deviations, interquartile ranges, etc., to give the reader a sense of how big is the measurement of this variable, and how variable is it? How much does this variable vary within the sample? And they're going to do the same thing with the independent variables. And then typically here you begin with the key independent variable of interest, which in their case is the real minimum wage. Next section is the methods section, and methods explain how the authors analyzed and answered their research question. Often this section will begin with a text description of what they did. In this case, they identify the causal effect of an increase in the minimum wage on risky health behaviors using within-state variation in the timing of minimum wage increases. So they're telling us in words that they're going to be using the fact that different states passed minimum wage laws over time, and that led to changes in the minimum wage in a state. And then they're also providing a formula or an equation showing how this outcome variable, typically denoted by y, is related to the minimum wage variable. And they also define the notation. They say that a person is denoted by I, who lives in state A, month M, and year T. So we have a way to map the variation that we're seeing, minimum wage AT, to the person specific outcomes, the YIAMTW, or MT. Lastly, they're going to explain what hypothesis they're testing. So for this paper, they're making a test based on the idea that some goods are normal goods, so consumption should increase with the minimum wage because of an income effect, but that the minimum wage also affects the opportunity cost of many of these goods, or many of these health-related activities that may worsen health. So there's an ambiguity in their hypothesis because they've got a positive effect, right? This normal good, therefore consumption should go up effect, offset by a substitution effect or a price effect that says, well, it's more expensive to go work out at the gym now because your wage went up. So therefore you should be doing less exercise, for example. The next section is the results section, where the paper explains what the answer was. And it typically includes a number of tables and or figures to present the results and descriptions of each set of results. And as we go through the results section, the text is going to call out where to find the results being discussed. So here you see references to panels A and B of table 3. So we know exactly where to go to find the results that they're going to talk about next. Now let's think about how they discuss the estimates from the table. So the paper will discuss the results in those panels, and in some cases, that means restating what the coefficients were, but typically the text will highlight some of the qualitative characteristics of the results. And then translate those coefficients into more meaningful units. So what is the effect of a $1 increase of the minimum wage on some of their outcomes? And lastly, results sections can also include things like subgroup analyses. What's going on between men versus women, for example. A robustness analysis, or robustness checks, that they use to ensure that they're robust to various issues with time trends and sample selection. And a sensitivity analysis, which for their paper is sensitivity of their results to different kinds of minimum wage measures. The final section, or sometimes two sections of a paper, are the discussion and conclusions. These discussions put the results in context, so they first provide a brief rehash of what was found. So in this paper, for example, they found that there's an effect of the minimum wage on these health-related activities. And then they're going to compare their results to others that are in the literature. And this is very important to do because it gives the authors an opportunity to reconcile differences between what they find and what other people have found, and to reinforce their results by saying, well, our results are similar to what other people have found. And the final section in the discussion and conclusion section is a section on limitations in the results. And this is a very important section where the authors get to highlight and discuss the limitations of their work. So it sounds silly, why would I highlight my limitations? You highlight your limitations because that provides the authors with the opportunity to state what they perceive those limitations to be and how those limitations affect the interpretation of the results. Maybe a limitation is not a big deal because a particular way in which the results are limited should not matter for the interpretation that's of interest. And finally, a paper may draw broader conclusions for society by among other things, drawing inferences out of the results and extrapolating to other groups, other situations, etc.